Okay, today we have the fourth class. It is devoted to emergence of new independent states and territories with incomplete sovereign status. Emergence of new independent states and territories with incomplete sovereign status is linked to developments of late Soviet period. And it's quite clear why. Because as we were discussing last time, the stateness of Soviet republics, as well as of other polities that composed Soviet Union, actually was very much determined by their existence within Soviet Union. And their further development as independent polities, of course, to a great extent, was influenced by that fact. So the changes in the old order that have taken place since 1845 have reached a fairly decisive stage by the end of 86, beginning of 87. And at that time, one could easily observe signs of crumbling of Soviet empire at the periphery. Here and there, off and on, all kinds of unrest and protest have been cropping up. The first cases of unrest were clearly linked to contradictions of Soviet politics, and those contradictions were most visible in the peripheries. On the one hand, those cases of unrest were as a rule spontaneous, but on the other hand, they were often provoked by events in the official political sphere. A prototypical example of this kind are events that have swept the capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty, at the very end of 1986. At the 16th session of Communist Party of Kazakhstan in January 1986, so about a year in advance to the events that we're discussing now, the newly appointed Prime Minister of the Republic, Nursultan Nazarbayev, criticized Askar Kunayev, head of Academy of Sciences and brother of the boss of Kazakhstan, Din Muhammad Kunayev, who was first secretary of Republican Communist Party and CPSU Politburo member for quite a long period of time. So Nazarbayev criticized his brother for mistakes and lapses in his work. And this criticism has provoked a fairly distinct public response. Kunayev himself was very much angered. He went to Moscow and demanded Nazarbayev's dismissal. On the other hand, people in Almaty and in various other places in Kazakhstan were campaigning for Kunayev's dismissal and promotion of Nazarbayev. Gorbachev has been confronted with this very uneasy choice. On the one hand, there was an old guard, influential Politburo member, and on the other hand, there was a new, promising young leader. But the choice was very difficult for Gorbachev at this stage, at least. So he didn't want to risk getting into very open and very radical confrontation with the old guard. So Gorbachev took the middle way. He fired Kunayev, but did not replace him with his opponent. On December 16, the Soviet Politburo dismissed Kunayev, and Gennady Kolbin from Ulyanovsk was appointed as his successor. In fact, the two following days, December 16 and December 17, Almaty saw riots of young people. The capital of Kazakhstan was full of crowds shouting against appointment of Kolbin, and those events are very well known in Kazakh language as Zheltoksan. Demonstrations were violently suppressed by authorities. Reportedly, between 2 and 20 people lost their lives, hundreds were injured and arrested. Still, Kolbin remained in power. Repressions were directed against young people and against Komsomol of Kazakhstan. And the situation calmed down visibly, but at the bottom the unrest still was going on, and what is more important, this unrest provided a very significant example for other parts of the country, since events in Almaty became very well known. A different development could be observed in Baltic republics. Democratic forces and nationalist forces there launched what was later known as Baltic Way. This was actually a name that they were using for as a kind of a catchword, as a slogan for their activities, and as a name for a number of events that had been organized during Perestroika period in Baltic republics. Estonians began to voice demands for national independence, starting with a large public demonstrations in Tallinn in August 1987. In June next year, Lithuanian reform movement Sąjūdis, or Union, was organized to demand fundamental political reform. And probably this was the best organized organization in Baltic republics, although in other republics also similar People's Fronts have been organized. In Lithuania, another very important development took place. The Lithuanian branch of Communist Party actually split it, and majority under the first secretary of the party, the official head of the party, Algirdas Brazauskas, started to advocate pro-independence and democratic views. There was also a third pattern, third type of unrest and protest, and this type was very much related to development of statehood, consolidation of statehood. But this was actually typical not so much of Union republics, but of other entities. And Karabakh developments in this regard could be considered quite important. And they actually radicalized the whole course of perestroika. On the 13th February of 1988, massive manifestations started in Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, and people were demanding withdrawal of the oblast from Azerbaijan Republic. Well, the reasons for these demands were quite obvious. On the one hand, there was a visible increase in nationalistic feelings of Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, but on the other hand, there were significant grievances that people actually complained of, and that were related to discrimination policies of then leadership of Azerbaijan. On February 20th, the Soviet, the official state authority of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, voted to request a transfer into Armenia. Well, this immediately created a very tense situation, not only in the oblast itself, but also in Armenian-Azerbaijani relations and in the Soviet Union in general. Actually, Gorbachev called this action a knife in the back of perestroika. Probably this was slightly exaggerated, but the spiral of confrontation and violence actually very quickly led to bloodshed. On 27th and 28th of February, a pogrom of Armenians was perpetrated in Sumgait, an industrial center close to Baku, and in some other places in Azerbaijan. Dozens of people were killed, hundreds of people were seriously injured, and many thousands had to flee from Baku, from other big cities of Azerbaijan, some to Armenia, but mainly they flew to Russia. After those events, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh actually accelerated, and well before the collapse of Soviet Union, the actual civil war there in the region have started. But with all the importance of events in the periphery, the major acceleration to development of statehood in various regions of Soviet Union were, of course, related to dynamics of perestroika itself. The summer of 1988 was a crucial moment for the reform process. In fact, we'll follow step by step a number of crucial points, points that were particularly important for consolidation of new polities, for their new re-identification, and for development of their institutions, for the development of their statehood. So in summer 88, in June in fact, the 19th All-Union Party Conference has been called. This conference was a forum where Gorbachev decided to carry out important formal decisions related to reform of the Soviet Union. 6 reform-oriented resolutions have been adopted by this conference, and 2 were directly related to political reform. This one gave a general outline of the directions of that reform, while the other one focused on immediate steps to be taken. And the most important step to be taken was decision to launch competitive elections. First competitive elections were scheduled for the spring of next year. It took a few months to prepare them. Then there was a very turbulent and very intensive electoral campaign, which led to elections of March 26 of 1989. These were the first competitive elections, and in various constituencies, a big number of people. In some constituencies, there were more than 20 or 30 candidates running. People were organizing meetings, manifestations, having debates So the campaign was really very, very heightened and turbulent. Citizens were to elect 2/3 of people's deputies, who would constitute the Congress of People's Deputies, and 1/3 was nominated by public organizations, including, for example, Communist Party, Young Communist League, trade unions, and all other kind of official organizations. The result of the electoral campaign was fairly visible. In many parts of the country, activists of reform movements were elected, many of whom were advocating development of statehood of union and autonomous republics. Quite a number of old guard politicians couldn't pass the threshold and become deputies. In fact, 30 top party officials were defeated in the elections, which was a very significant sign indicating the profound change in public opinion. About the same time, unrest swept Georgia and Abkhazia. In fact, this was the second instance where an attempt to develop independent polities have actually taken place. On April 9th of 1989, big manifestations that were taking place in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, were repressed by Soviet army. It dispersed demonstrators, but in the actions about 20 civilians were killed. So this produced a shocking impression on all the country, and the people of Congress deputies actually have created a special commission that had to carry out investigation, and the work of this commission was in the center of public opinion. So those developments actually influenced quite a lot general developments in the country and in Georgia itself. In fact, those events significantly contributed to clashes that have taken place in Abkhazia, an autonomous republic that was part of Georgia at that time. In fact, protests swept the capital of Georgia, Sukhumi, and people were protesting against transformation of Georgian section of Sukhumi State University into a branch of Tbilisi University. Many people in Sukhumi were interpreting those changes as a sign that the government in Tbilisi is going to further press down the Abkhaz education and introduce Georgian education in Sukhumi to a great extent. So Abkhaz nationalists and Democrats protested. They clashed with the Georgians, and 18 people were killed during the events, and quite a number of people were injured. As a result of those events, demands for independent Abkhazia started to be voiced, and gradually, in a few months, the whole situation there actually developed into a situation close to civil war. Now we're coming to a second focal point. This focal point in development of perestroika and in development of movement for independent stateness of various polities of Soviet Union was related to local and Republican elections that were held in March of 1990. I must say that this was the second attempt to run competitive elections. And this time, those elections were far better prepared. People were already prepared as well to run more consciously in elections and to develop electoral campaigns. Campaigns themselves were far more democratic, and what is more important, the campaign was fairly much decentralized, quite naturally, because there were different campaigns in different republics, and actually there were different campaigns also on local levels. So what we have is a number of alternative patterns of running elections that could be observed in the country. In fact, election conditions and election formulas used significantly differed throughout the country. Same is true about results, who were probably even more radically different than results of the previous elections. By way of example, we can cite elections that have taken place in Baltic republics. By far, electoral campaigns there were better prepared and better run than in many other parts of the country. In fact, the electoral commissions, the authorities there, were experimenting with all kinds of different electoral formulas. A single transferable vote election, for example, was held in elections for Supreme Soviet of Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic that took place on March 18, 1990. The general turnout was 78.2%, and the pro-independence Popular Front of Estonia claimed 41 seats. The Communist Free Estonia Group and its allies got 25 seats. The Anti-Independence Joint Council Work Collectives got 26 seats. The allegiances of 13 deputies were unclear. But results clearly show that pro-independence majority emerged there. What is also important, that in Estonia, as well as in other Baltic republics, in those elections participated also the Russian-speaking population. Actually, there was no discrimination at that time in those republics, and the Russian population also voted for independence in general terms. Same is true of Latvia. In Latvia, the turn was even greater, 81.3%. The election was competitive, but not strictly along party lines. Many candidates running were independents. Altogether, 131 seats was won by pro-independence candidates, of which 111 were affiliated with the Popular Front of Latvia, and 52 also had sometimes overlapping affiliation with the Communist Party. There were 55 anti-independence candidates elected as communist supporters of Soviet Union, and the remainder of seats went to uncommitted candidates. So again, we see a clear preference given to pro-independence candidates. Lithuanian elections were actually held prior to most of the elections that were held in the country. In fact, in all the republics except Lithuania and in all local areas, elections were held in March, while in Lithuania they shifted elections somewhat earlier on February 24th. So voters choose 141 deputies in single-member districts by absolute majority in the first round, and in the absence of majority, a second-round vote was required between the two leading candidates. That means they were using majoritarian system with 2 rounds of vote, so another pattern of voting. As we see in different places of Soviet Union, in different republics, different electoral formulas were used. After all rounds were completed, Saudis, that's the reform organization in Lithuania, has won 92 seats. But this group of 92 deputies was in effect a multi-party group of people, because they had different political affiliations or inclinations rather, because in some cases the political structures, political parties have not yet been finally formed. So out of 92 seats won by Saudis, 17 went to nationally oriented communists. They were members of Communist Party but still were running on the list of Saudis, or were campaigning under the slogans of Saudis. 9 went to people who claimed to be social democrats, 4 to activists of Green Movement, and 2 to people who claimed to be Christian Democrats. 32 seats were filled by Independent Lithuanian Communist Party, 7 by Pro-Soviet Lithuanian Communists, a splinter group. As I told you, Lithuanian Communist Party actually split it earlier before this election, so this orthodox hardline Lithuanian communists got only 7 places, and 10 got by independents who were quite unclear in their affiliations. So results of those elections actually provoked what one can describe as independence drive among Soviet republics. And it's not by chance that this independence drive actually started in Baltic area, in Baltic republics. Lithuanians were the first to organize elections, so they were first also to start their movement towards independence, and they were first to claim sovereignty. Already on March 11th, that is, on the eve of elections in other parts of Soviet Union, the newly elected Lithuanian Assembly, Soviet, of Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republics, proclaimed independence. It was a very visible and very clear step taken. Why this happened? Well, because the Reformation movement was very strong within the Lithuanian Communist Party, and Algirdas Brazauskas himself, the leader of the party, was clearly supporting it and was actually leader of the whole movement. So the same developments also swept other Baltic republics, and about 12 days after the elections, on March 31st, Estonian Soviet, by vote of 78-8, declared the country was in transition to independence. So the resolution was put in somewhat milder terms compared with Lithuanian, but still the meaning of the resolution taken there was quite evident. And what is even more evident is that you can see from the results of the vote that many undecided and even deputies that were reserved about Estonian independence actually voted for the resolution that called for transition to independence. So the newly elected Latvian Assembly was somewhat comparatively lagging behind. Only on May 8th it reclaimed independence, but did it in a very sound way, legally sound way, reclaiming its Latvia's independence on the basis of its 1922 constitution of the previous independent Latvian state that existed between the two wars. So this process actually provoked what was later called by Soviet politicians and Soviet journalists, Soviet public, as parade of sovereignties. In this parade of sovereignties, the Baltic case was somewhat unique because they all claimed sovereignty during the spring of 1990, and the rest of the country actually did it somewhat later. Decisive role has been played by Russia. It was the Congress of People's Deputies of Russian Federation, newly elected body, the Supreme Soviet of Russian Federation, that on June 12th issued declaration of sovereignty. This declaration made a profound impact on developments in the whole country. In fact, other republics, in the situation when Russia, the biggest republic, the centerpiece of the Union, is proclaiming its sovereignty, this situation made declarations of sovereignty of different republics almost inevitable. So following Russia's example, Uzbekistan and Moldova declared their sovereignty in June, and next month Ukraine and Belarus did it in July. Well, Armenia, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan followed suit in August. Kazakhstan did it in October, and the last of all in the parade of sovereignties came Kyrgyzia in December, at the very end of the year. Now we're coming to the third focal point that was particularly important for development of new independence movements and promotion of new institutions of independent statehood in various republics. This focal point was related to initiatives undertaken by Gorbachev, who wanted to strengthen Union, to reform it, of course, to reform the Soviet Union, but also strengthen it, to reconsolidate it in a different political structure. So to do that, Gorbachev and his supporters in the leadership of the party decided to launch referendum on the revival of the Union, on reshaping of the Union. The referendum was scheduled on March 17, 1991. Already by that time, the situation was so much polarized that many champions of independent stateness were openly resisting the idea of this referendum. But despite of their efforts, results were quite decisively in favor of the Union. The general population in the country, in the Soviet Union, overwhelmingly voted for restoration and renewal of the Union, and the results were overwhelming support for it in Russia. Support was more than 71%, in Ukraine more than 70%, in Belarus, in Central Asian republics, and in many other parts of the country. But of course, opponents to the idea of a revival of the Soviet Union also were quite active. They realized that it would be very difficult to oppose the challenge of Gorbachev, who was still commanding quite a significant influence in public opinion. So in some parts of the Soviet Union, the tactics was to launch an alternative referenda. Particularly this was true of Baltic republics. There they have launched their advance referenda, Republican referenda, and those referenda were actually on independence of republics. Lithuania was again the first. On February 9th, in Lithuania, more than 90% of voters endorsed independence. The turnout was 84.7%. So very significant vote, pro-independence vote in Lithuania. Clearly indicated the change of public opinion. Actually, public opinion was very much split. The people were both for independence and for reform of Soviet Union. Quite a number of people were thinking that both alternatives could be taken together, that they could be reconciled in some way. This explains results of both the all-union referendum and of Republican referendum. As for other republics, on March 3rd, referendum in Estonia also voted for independence. The turnout was 83%, and 77% voted for independence. Actually, in this vote participated overwhelming majority of ethnic Estonians and more than quarter of non-Estonians also voted for independence. Well, at least these were evaluations that sociologists have made there, people who were observing elections. On March 3rd, referendum in Latvia also voted in favor of democratic and independent Republic of Latvia. 73.7% of voters supported that option, with a general turnout of 87.6%. But it's quite interesting that 24.7% voted against. So this also indicates that, particularly in Latvia, the situation was quite polarized and very heated. But even those percentages clearly show that a significant proportion of Russian-speaking citizens of the Republic were splitted, and many of them actually voted for independence, favored independence. Situation in Georgia and Abkhazia, where, as you remember, was already very tense and was on the brink of civil war. Actually, referenda there directly contributed to the development of this self-concealed civil war into an outright armed conflict. I must say that Georgia actually made decision to boycott the all-union referendum, and it organized a referendum on their own on Georgia's independence, which was scheduled for March 31st. In this situation, authorities in Abkhazia and people in Abkhazia overwhelmingly participated in the all-union referendum, so in opposition to Georgian leadership. And in this uneasy situation, more than half of the population of Abkhazia, virtually all non-Georgians, took part in the referendum and voted by an overwhelming majority, 98.6%, in favor of preserving the union. Subsequently, the same people actually declined to participate in March 31st referendum on Georgian independence, which actually collapsed in Abkhazia. Although formally there were attempts to carry out this referendum, but its result were actually insignificant because of the resistance and boycott by the majority. But in Georgia, of course, the overwhelming majority of people, in other parts of Georgia, the overwhelming majority of people voted for independence. And shortly after this referendum, Georgia declared its independence on April 9th of 91. Gorbachev was concentrating more and more of his efforts on reform of the union and of keeping the union together. So I must say that actually most of his efforts in 91 were directed to this end. In January of 91, he started the so-called Novo-Ogareva process, a series of meetings that was named after a dacha near Moscow, where leaders of republics met to do political deals on renewal of Union Treaty. Of course, the process was very uneasy, very contradictory, particularly because the leaders of the republics were bounded by their commitments, political commitments in their republics, because of the results of referenda for independence that have been carried out in various republics, as well as for resolutions passed for the sake of, as you remember, during the previous year, during the so-called Parade of Sovereignties, this kind of resolutions have been passed by every single republic. But despite of that, not only people in the country were thinking that it is still possible to develop sovereign statehood of individual republics and to maintain the union, but also politicians were forced to follow this logic. And the energy of and wisdom of Gorbachev actually led to certain results. By July, the Novo-Ogareva process produced a draft of Union Treaty. New Union Treaty. Of course, this Union Treaty was fairly contradictory. If you look in the text of this document, you would see lots of paradoxes and uneasy institutional solutions that were really a puzzle for constitutional legislation. For example, republics were free to sign new treaty, but those who refused would remain bound by the old treaty of 1922. So this contradiction actually meant that there were two legal standards, two legal foundations for participation of individual republics in the so-called reformed union. The text of the new treaty was scheduled to be signed on August 20th of 1991. And here we are coming probably to a most decisive stage in the development of the whole process of perestroika and development of new statehood, of new polities that replaced Soviet Union. In early morning of August 19, an attempt to launch coup d'etat have been undertaken by a group of people in the Soviet leadership. Gorbachev was in Crimea at that moment, so he was actually arrested there in Crimea, and they wouldn't let him come to Moscow. They issued a declaration of Soviet leadership that informed public that a state committee for the state of emergency, the so-called GKCP, have been established, and the state of emergency have been introduced in the country. Vice President Yanayev announced that he was assuming presidential powers in view of Gorbachev's inability to carry out duties of the President of USSR for reasons of ill health. During the next 3 days, August 19th, August 20th and August 21st, Moscow was in a turmoil of protest involving hundreds of thousands of people. After a tense standoff, the divided army withdrew and the coup leaders threw in the towel. The Gorbachev has been flown back to Moscow, and on the following days, on August 22nd, the crowds attacked the buildings of Central Committee of CPSU, KGB, and various other headquarters of notorious institutions. Statues and other symbols of Soviet power were torn down, and in the following weeks the structure of CPSU itself was dismantled and party was dissolved. Now we're coming to a very uneasy stage of dismantling of the Union. On September 2nd of 91, the Congress of People's Deputies issued a joint declaration of the President of USSR and the leading officials of Union Republics. So this declaration that was legitimized by the Congress was aimed at setting up provisional, transitory structure and transitory institutions that could cope with the situation. This declaration announced a new transitional institutions to replace existing power structures until the Union Treaty would be signed. Gorbachev and some of his colleagues still hoped that it would be possible to overcome the crisis and to revive the Union Treaty, although it was absolutely clear that even this modest compromise that has been reached in July of 1991 couldn't be the practical point of agreement, that the new agreement has to be negotiated. So to do that, there were established transitional bodies to oversee home policies, foreign policies and economy, with membership drawn from republics. There was to be a council also composed by delegates from the republics to work on new constitution for the Union. The declaration, I must say, effectively created conditions for dismantling of the Union, rather than provided framework for the work on the new Union Treaty. But this, of course, didn't mean that Gorbachev and other champions of the Union would stop their efforts to maintain the Union. In early autumn, the Novo-Ogarevo process has been resumed, and on October 18, actually a treaty on economic community was signed by all republics except Ukraine. In fact, even republics that were most pro-independent found it quite pragmatic and viable to sign such a treaty. Economic community was something that really was necessary and could maintain the unity of the new emerging independent states. A draft treaty on the union of sovereign states has also been worked out, but it hadn't been signed because Ukraine again withdrew its assent. There was an impasse, in fact. The Ukrainian leader Leonid Kravchuk didn't want to sign before results of Ukrainian referendum on sovereignty. Well, probably the last one, or one of the last referendum on this issue that was held in republics. Actually, this referendum was to be held on December 1st. Gorbachev, being too cocksure of his influence upon public opinion in Ukraine, declared for his part that he couldn't conceive the union without Ukraine. And actually, it was he who insisted on publication of the text of the Treaty of the Union of Sovereign States that he hoped would influence results of Ukrainian referendum. But unfortunately he failed. The results of referendum were massively pro-independence. So this actually brought the whole history of Soviet Union to a final conclusive point, to the last days of the Union. On December 3rd, Gorbachev called on Republican parliaments to prevent the collapse of USSR. In fact, he had no other authority and no other resource but to appeal to Republican parliaments who actually have been committed for independence. To greater or lesser extent, of course. The forces that were opposing Gorbachev actually made a decisive blow, and on December 8th, Yeltsin, the leader of Russian Federation and the bitter opponent of Gorbachev, Kravchuk, the leader of Ukraine, and Shushkevich, the leader of Belarus, had reached agreement to withdraw from USSR and form the Community of Independent States. On December 21st, Community of Independent States was officially created in Almaty after a period of certain hesitation. All the other union leadership had to agree to this minimal framework for the so-called civilized divorce of Union republics of USSR. As we have already discussed, this has created a unique situation when the country, the Union, the Soviet Union, has been divided into 15 Union republics, and also there were, as we already mentioned, 8 other cases, 8 other territories that also were trying to develop their independent statehood. Some of them we have already mentioned during this class. They are Nagorno Karabakh, or Artsakh as they call it in Armenian. Another was Abkhazia. Similar developments have taken place in another autonomous republic of Georgia, Southern Ossetia. Then there was quite an important developments in Moldova, where one part of the small republics, so-called Transnistria, was trying to develop statehood of its own, and in southern parts of Transnistria, ethnic Turkic-speaking people of Gagauz nationality also tried to establish their own homeland. And finally, we cannot avoid mentioning also the events that have taken place both in Crimea and Chechnya, where Republican local leaders were trying to raise their status up to the level of independent statehood. But discussion of developments that took place after December 21st of 1991 is a matter of our next class.